Welcome to people joining us at home. Welcome to our panelists. Thanks to our audience for joining. I can see that the Zoom room is starting to fill up and we'll be starting momentarily. Thank you to everyone who's joining. You're watching our webinar discussion, Canada and AMLO. What's Ottawa's policy towards Mexico's reformist government? So again, a big welcome to people at home. Thank you to our panelists for being here. We have an important event ahead, and it's terrific to be here with our guest panelists, José Luis Granados Ceja, Owen Schalk, Lucy Sharratt, Meizhu Lui. My name is Bianca Mageni, and I'm with the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, who are the organizers of today's event. And I want to offer thanks as well to our co-sponsoring organization, the Mexico Solidarity Project. You can find out more about them at mexicosolidarityproject.org. And I'm speaking to you from Jojage, or Montreal, which is situated on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka people. And for folks at home, we're live streaming to Facebook as well. And I'll be putting the link in the chat. And we'd love it if you could share so that more people can tune into this discussion. So the chat is open, so please do say hi, let us know where you're tuning in from. We love to hear from you. After our speakers give their introductory remarks, we're going to be opening up to questions from the audience. So please do put your questions in the Q&A box, which you can find sort of at the bottom of your screen. Hi, Yuri, great to hear from you. Yeah, so please do share your questions. Again, I'm Bianca. I'm here with the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, which is an organization that challenges unjust foreign policy measures and aims to bridge the gap between the perception and reality of Canada's role in the world. And we also seek to challenge and oppose the racism that's embedded in Canadian foreign policy. So you can find out more about our work at foreignpolicy.ca. We are an organization that's funded entirely through donations, so please do consider donating or becoming a sustainer at foreignpolicy.ca/donation. So today's webinar is titled Canada and AMLO, What's Ottawa's Policy Towards Mexico's Reformist Government? And what we're trying to do with this event is to understand what some of the positive transformations that are taking place in Mexico are and what Ottawa's reaction has been to them. And obviously, we don't want to paint too rosy of a picture. You know, there are many legitimate criticisms of the Mexican government, but there's also many inspiring domestic reforms and regional policies, and some of those we'll be hearing about today. Before speakers get into some of the current developments and Canada's responses, I wanted to share a little bit of sort of less discussed Canadian foreign policy history in Mexico, which is detailed on our wiki at our site foreignpolicy.ca. So in little known history, in the lead up to the 1910-1917 Mexican Revolution, Canadian corporate interests worked closely with the dictator Porfirio Diaz and controlled significant interest, tramways, electricity banks. They called on Britain and the US to intervene in the Mexican Revolution. In 1915, in the first ever example of Canadian gunboat diplomacy, the HMCS Rainbow was dispatched to Mazatlan to protect British interests and the expatriate community. Later in history, as part of the neoliberal reforms that were leading up to the signing of NAFTA in the early 90s, communal land ownership rules drawn up after the Mexican Revolution was changed. And partly as a result, Canadian mining exploded in the country. And today, what we see is that Canadian firms dominate Mexican mining with some $20 billion invested there. And there have been many disputes that we're seeing between Canadian companies and local communities. And now we're even seeing that at times AMLO has been criticizing Canadian firms regarding these environmental and tax concerns. So this is important history and context to consider as we seek to make sense of Canada's current relations with Mexico and their reactions towards all of these reforms. So now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first panelist of the evening, José Luis Granados Ceja. José is a journalist and political analyst based in Mexico City. He's a staff writer with Venezuela Analysis, covering regional and international issues, and writes a monthly opinion column for the Mexico Solidarity Project. hearing him speak recently about the situation in Mexico at a recent meeting that I attended actually inspired this event. So welcome, Jose.
Hello, everybody. It's really good to be here. And I'm really grateful to the organizers and the panelists today for putting this together and having this conversation. This is probably the right audience to say this to, right? Too often, I think Canada and its imperialist policies, particularly in Latin America, sort of fly under the radar. And I think it's important that we actually pay specific attention to it because it does manifest itself in a pretty particular way, and one that requires us to have a more nuanced analysis. I think it's often easy to fall into the trap of thinking that it's just following the lead of US imperialism. It certainly does, but it does play a unique role. So I'm gonna ask the host to enable screen sharing because I have a little bit of a PowerPoint that's gonna accompany the presentation.
Is it working for you now?
It is now. Great. Thank you. Okay. So I'm just here to talk about, as we said, Mexico's defense of national sovereignty and Canadian imperialism. And I'm using that kind of language really deliberately because this is the kind of conversation that's happening now in Mexico on those terms. You know, it's often that we kind of only hear about this word sovereignty and in a very specific context. It is often in academic spaces, but I think it's something that's now really entering the public lexicon as a part of the broader consciousness raising that's happening here in the country. And it's being done explicitly so in order to mobilize the population on that basis. And I'm going to get into that in a little bit. But I think it's important to begin by talking a little bit for folks who may not be familiar with the situation in Mexico. What is happening now? Bianca mentioned at the beginning that she had seen me participate in a different presentation, and that's because for the first time in a long time, suddenly there was a lot of English language international media attention on Mexico. And it's because of a very specific process that's happening here in the country, which I'll get to in a minute. But to get to that, I wanted to start with this, right? What is happening in Mexico? So Mexico was ruled by neoliberal regimes, basically since the 80s. We're talking 30 plus years of the neoliberal consensus very much being applied here in a very orthodox manner. We had a very pliant regime, first with Enrique de la Madrid, followed by Carlos Salinas de Gortari, and then Cedillo, and then Fox, Calderón, Peña Nieto, and then bringing us to the present with López Obrador. So everybody before López Obrador that I mentioned was very much committed to the neoliberal project. The US, Canada, Mexico relationship is one that's very much been defined by the trade relationship between the three countries. And I think particularly US and Canada were very much interested in having Mexico occupy a very specific role in the North American economy as a source of cheap labor, as a source of cheap raw materials, as a source of cheap energy. Obviously, that is very beneficial to the interests of the ruling class in the US and Canada and the interests of US and Canadian capital in particular. And they had very pliant, accommodating political regime here in Mexico up until 2018. So what happens in 2018? It's a landslide victory, overwhelming victory by the Morena party, which is it's an acronym for the National Regeneration Movement. So he won by over 30 million votes, beating his nearest rival by 30 points. So that's probably the strongest mandate that a president has had in what we could say is Mexico's modern history. Other presidents had ridiculous results, like somewhere 90%, but that's during the pre-dictatorship. So it's hard to say that there's actually reflected that kind of mandate. This one certainly did. And obviously that also meant that there was a very strong legislature that was also elected at the same time that it helped enable what is called here in Mexico, the fourth transformation. So what do we mean by the fourth transformation? Well, the first one was the independence period, the struggle against the Spanish Empire to establish independence here in Mexico. The second is the reform under Benito Juárez, which was the sort of the liberal conservative battle that happened in many parts of the world, Mexico being no exception, sort of cementing a liberal regime. The third transformation being the Mexican Revolution, which happened in the early 20th century, which was a bit of a curious case, where we had certainly very strong socialist, anarchist tendencies, but it was very much a democratic struggle. It was a struggle against a dictatorship, but one that carried the masses with it, and particularly the campesinos and their demands, and actually implanted that into the Mexican Constitution. And that brings us to the present, right? The fourth transformation of Mexico. And that's a deliberate choice. It's sort of a bit of a political choice by the president to try to one, link to these previous three transformations, but to also say that this is truly a change of regime, right? I often use the language of the ancien regime, the old regime being the neoliberal regime that the López Obrador government replaced. And I think it's important to kind of think of it in those terms. And what does that mean? Well, like I said, it's strictly an anti-neoliberal project. I think it's very accurate that the name of this event is, Mexico's reformist governments. We shouldn't have any illusions. This isn't Venezuela. This isn't Bolivia. This is very much a sort of a social democratic reformist project, one that is sort of betting on establishing a welfare state in the country, trying to bring development to the most neglected regions of the country. This is a country that still has 60 million people that live in poverty and extreme poverty. So it's about attending to the needs of that. The slogan in the country is that López Obrador often uses is for the good of everybody, but the poor first. Por el bien de todos, pero los pobres primero. And so this is very specific, run very much situated on the left. And that doesn't mean that there aren't criticisms coming from the left of the government, but that's kind of a little bit beyond of what we're here to talk about today. Another part of it is, like I said, a nationalist development strategy, this idea that we should use the country's natural resources in order to drive the country's national development, to bring investments and resources and jobs and welfare and social services, et cetera, to the whole of the country, but in particular, those that have been neglected for the longest time. How was that done? Specifically, it's been through the rescue of Pemex, the state oil company, and the Federal Electricity Commission. So these are two state-owned companies. The first one is the more interesting one because as we're familiar in Canada, there was a project of neoliberalism, which was specifically to try to weaken these state-owned institutions, these state-owned companies, in order to open them up to privatization. It's all very much what's happening in Ontario, for example, with the healthcare system. They're trying to say that the private capital must come in because the system is not working to people's satisfaction. So that's very much the same strategy, and it was able to advance pretty significantly over the last 30 years, but wasn't able to be consolidated. And so that allowed López Obrador, once he came into his government, to be able to kind of turn the levers back, to return to a period where they do occupy a prominent place in the country's economic development. And so what does that mean? That means using these resources, using the wealth that is derived from the sale of oil into the international market to redistribute wealth. Very, very much kind of that social democratic motto, which is to say specifically a massive expansion of direct cash transfer programs. We're talking, a sort of a reorganization of what the welfare system in the country looked like, whereas previously it was a lot of kind of needs-based, merit-based programs, sort of that were kind of targeted to certain communities. That kind of lended itself a lot to manipulation, to vote buying, the kind of means that in which the PRI was able to stay in power for so long. But now this one is about direct transfer programs. So, a guaranteed universal pension for seniors, scholarships for students, money so that people can plant trees. I could go on and on, but it gives you an idea of what they're doing, to the point that, as it says here, 71% of Mexican households now benefit from at least one social program. So that speaks to the level of expansion of this program that we've been able to witness over the last few years under this government. So, like I mentioned at the beginning, we were talking a little bit about why Mexico has been in the news lately. And so you may have heard that López Obrador is like part of the authoritarian tendencies of Mexico and Latin America because of this reform to the country's electoral authority. And I wrote an article for The Nation, and I opened it with this line that I want to repeat to you here, which is: the protest against Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador's reforms to the National Electoral Institute, or INE by a Spanish acronym, must be understood in the context of the opposition's declining sway. So what does that mean? So since the election of López Obrador in 2018, Morena, his party, has won 12 out of the 15 governorship races, and that brings him to a total of 20 out of 32 federal entities. It means a state in Mexico City. Mexico City is so big that it's actually a bit of a city-state, and that are now under control. So it's a massive expansion of Morena's political power and territorial reach. There's some contradictions in there as well, like, not all the candidates are necessarily cut of the same cloth, but it still speaks to the level of support that exists in the country for Morena. And the problem is that the opposition is made up of these parties. So the PRI and the PAN, which had previously been in government, the last government was a PRI government with Enrique Peña Nieto. The PRI is the party that almost ruled for a century here until 2000, when the PAN under Vicente Fox, and then subsequently followed by Felipe Calderón, who was actually installed as a result of a fraudulent election, but we don't have time to get into that. These are the parties. And then there's also what used to be a leftist party, but one that very much accommodated itself to the ruling political elites here in the country, the PRD, the Party of the Democratic Revolution, and Citizens Movement, which is sort of a third position, posits itself as a progressive party, but it's actually very right-wing when it actually has governed in a handful of states. So these parties, the opposition, they're very much cooperating now. They exist in several coalitions together. There is very much an expectation that they're going to present a single candidate in the next elections, presidential elections in 2024. These parties, they haven't been able to articulate a coherent response to this political reality. I'm of the belief that they kind of view it as an aberration, that it was a mistake, that the people were fooled and they voted for López Obrador and Morena, but soon enough things will go back to normal. And that's very much guided the way that they have been approaching the political reality in Mexico today, to their detriment. Because, as I said, they're not very successful electorally, they're not very successful when it comes to reading opinion polls, and so they're struggling to really kind of be able to carve out a new space. And so, like I say here, the political opposition now finds itself compelled to mobilize in the streets, but it's struggled to engage citizens and win support for their party. So they have to figure out different ways to try to, resonate with the public, and they're not doing a very good job. So they kind of are resorting to different tactics. And these are what I call the conservative strongholds. This is what happens often throughout Latin America when there is the consolidation of a progressive leftist political project, that the forces that were once in state power sort of scatter, and they find spaces where they can still exert that influence and be able to, influence the political scene, despite not being a particularly finding support, particularly amongst the population. And I always share this slide with these presentations because I think it kind of speaks to this. So the man pictured there is now the former head of the National Electoral Institute, somebody who's supposed to be an impartial observer, an arbiter of the Mexican elections. And you can see the smugness in his face there. It's actually an exchange that he was having with the representative of the legislature at the National Electoral Institute, just kind of that contempt, openly mocking, a duly elected representative, somebody who was never actually elected to be in this post. And if you have any doubts in terms of his lack of impartiality, as soon as he finished his post in early April, he went and joined Latinas, which is a news outlet funded by the opposition and key players inside of the opposition, basically as a media outlet that exists solely to strike blows against the government. And he went to become a columnist. So I think it's pretty obvious where his allegiances lie and why people were so uncomfortable with his leadership. But it speaks to what the opposition thinks and feels about the population. This is another comment that I always share. This is the way that they depict the supporters of the Morena, of the president, as a bunch of zombies who are just they're just being corralled around and being used as instruments. It's really kind of a very disrespectful attitude, and that kind of permeates the way that they approach politics in the country. And I think is very important when we're trying to understand what's going on in the country. So much so that in demonstrations, people will actually show up with their signs to say that nobody brought me here. I was brought here by the metro. They always say that people attend these rallies held by López Obrador because they offer them a sandwich and a fruit drink in exchange. It's it's quite classist and contemptuous of the population, but so much so that people actually have made a joke of it. They're like, I'm here because I made my own sandwich. That kind of speaks to a little bit of the sort of the mass character of the fourth transformation of Mexico. And so this is pretty much like the central hypothesis of my argument here. Because the opposition is unable to win over them, they seek to assert power and influence via other means. And what are those? The private media, which I mentioned one of them, but in general, the private media, the corporate media responds to the interests of its corporate owners and is very much against the redistributive, social democratic, welfare state elements of the national project, led by López Obrador, and very much defend that through the outlets that they own and control. They're also using the courts. The courts are notoriously corrupt. but that doesn't explain everything. Courts in Mexico are also very much an elite institution. And many of the people who sit on the Supreme Court, for example, have a certain allegiance to the people who put them there, the political parties that put them there. And so that influences their decision making. That's again, it's a deeper issue that we don't have time to get into. The INE, which I was talking about, and obviously what brings us together today, which is imperialism. So they are very much turning to imperialism, as that we've seen in other places. Namely, the first that come to mind is Venezuela. There's a lot of parallels in terms of what's happening in Mexico with what happened in Venezuela, which is basically when the opposition is unable to kind of be able to present themselves to the electorate in a way that is convincing. Well, they resort to external interference, and that's very much what's happening in Mexico today. And this kind of gets into, I'm going to just for the sake of time, I'm going to very quickly go through what this whole discussion around the INE was. So the National Electoral Institute is one of these conservative strongholds. It's a place where they're trying to act anti-democratically, which is pretty curious considering they're the arbiters of the electoral process in the country. So López Obrador has always said that he's not really someone who's interested in revenge and vengeance. And so despite very serious criticisms, legitimate criticisms of the National Electoral Institute, he said that he wasn't going to necessarily go after them, except that in 2021, the INE decided to cancel the registration of two of their candidates. They're listed there, one in Guerrero, one in Michoacán. And so they weren't able to present their party over relatively minor violations of electoral law. And so within the party supporters, the base of the fourth transformation of Mexico, this was very much viewed as a political action, as a means of trying to harm them, to take away their best candidate in order to try to help the opposition win in these races. Ultimately, it didn't work. Moreno won anyway. But in response, the president proposed a constitutional reform of the National Electoral Institute. So this so-called defense of the INE, the defense of national electoral, has become the rallying cry of the opposition. As I said at the beginning, because they don't have very much support beyond, that 25, 30% of the population that will support them no matter what, like sort of their solid base, they've kind of championed this. They've dressed themselves in this rallying cry of the defense of the INE, saying that they're the ones who are standing up to López Obrador. And so they called a demonstration. It was a very sizable demonstration. Estimates have 150, 200, 250,000 in the streets. That's a sizable demonstration. That's really important. We should recognize that they were able to mobilize that amount of people. But in response, López Obrador, and this is what I meant by this very much having a component that is the mass mobilization of the Mexican population. He called for his own demonstration to say, we too can mobilize. López Obrador comes from a very long history of street mobilizations for various reasons, but is very much capable, and people are very much responsive to these calls. And in this last one, 1 million people. I was on the streets of Mexico when it happened, and I can tell you, obviously, I didn't count them one by one, but certainly in terms of the rivers of people that were on the streets on that day, it's safe to say there were 1 million people. And that sends a very clear message. Okay, you're able to mobilize your supporters, we're able to mobilize ours, and there's more of us, right? And that also speaks to the widespread support that exists for this political project in the country. I think if you read most of the coverage, especially in the English language press, they kind of make it seem like he's out to lunch, that he doesn't have a lot of support, that he says ridiculous things in his press conferences, et cetera, et cetera. That's obviously read very differently here. He's a very, very, very well supported. Opinion polls consistently have him as the second most popular leader in the world. So it kind of speaks to just how important that mass base is, because the movement, the president is aware that there is this mass movement behind him. And here I'm just going to share us a couple of pictures from the demonstrations rally. This actually became a very iconic picture of the president that was taken by a colleague of mine, Luis Antonio Rojas, which kind of shows them, the wave of people, the embrace of the president. It's an amazing picture that I think really captures it. Here's another picture from the days. You can see that the rivers of people, and obviously the political message. AMLO, today, tomorrow, and always. That's kind of the conviction that people have. And so when he presented this constitutional reform, the party and its allies in the Congress weren't able to get the 2/3 majority. Like I said, the opposition was feeling invigorated because of the demonstration. They felt that this issue was finally getting them, some credibility amongst the public, and so they decided that they weren't going to support this constitutional reform. It requires a supermajority, which the ruling party doesn't have on its own, and so then again, strategically, the government response prevents a simple reform that doesn't require a supermajority, requires only a simple majority, which is called Plan B, and largely focus on making reforms to the National Electoral Institute, really kind of minor reforms, kind of things that anywhere else in the world probably wouldn't garner very much attention. But there's a political context here that made it become this big thing, and obviously brought the attention of pundits and politicians in the US and Canada. And like I said, largely focused on the reduction of spending, on personnel cuts, and reorganization. This more specifically eliminates redundant posts, expands voting rights, expands the possibility of electronic voting, and obviously responding to what started this all, which is the cancellation of 2 candidates, limits the ability of the INE to exclude political candidates. And so what happens? Well, it's the political dynamics here in the country. The opposition holds a second rally to reject this so-called Plan B. And in this one, I think it was important because they took less care to appear nonpartisan. The first one was very much kind of, there was only one speaker, it was a former head of the Electoral Institute, had a very kind of clear message that was very much focused on the Electoral Institute. Well, this one, like I said, because they were feeling like this is their issue, kind of took a much more partisan, they were political figures, on the stage, and they gave a very highly partisan speech saying that we're going to come after you, we're not going to let this happen, blah, blah, blah. Again, respectable amount. They filled the Zócalo. The Zócalo holds about 100,000 people. Again, estimates say there's 200,000 people that day. Again, I think it's important to mention that they do have a base. They are able to mobilize. A lot of people did take to the streets. But again, in response, López Obrador mobilizes his supporters. And what do we see? Mass turnout. And I really like this picture. This is a picture from the day on the 18th of March to commemorate the expropriation of Mexico's oil industry in 1938. And there's an image, there's a banner at the top, and it was hung from the building that faces the Zócalo, the big public square. If anyone's been to Mexico City, it's in front of the National Palace and the cathedral. And you'll see here, in defense of national sovereignty at the top, 1938, the nationalization, the expropriation of the oil industry, 1960, the nationalization of the electricity industry, and then 2022, the nationalization of lithium under López Obrador. And so kind of bringing all of those concepts together. That's another picture, sorry, I jumped really quick there, of the Zócalo filled with the president's supporters. So this demonstration happened on the 85th anniversary of the 1938 decree by President Lázaro Cárdenas that expropriated the oil industry. The theme of this rally was the defense of national sovereignty. This is what I was saying at the beginning, right? Explicitly on those terms that we're going to call the population to mobilize, to take the streets, and to hear a speech about the defense of national sovereignty. And he gave an hour-long speech talking about sort of the history behind it, the relationship with the United States at the time. And the calculations there were about 500,000 people. So a little bit less than the first one, but still a significant amount of people, and critically, more than the opposition's demonstration. So that mass character of this transformation, even though it doesn't necessarily manifest itself every aspect of what's happening in the country, there is still very much, and it's something I really like to highlight, that character, that the idea that the masses are conscious of what's happening, and they're very much willing to embrace calls to turn out. And so, like I said, there's this deliberate effort, it was seen on that banner that was at the top of the building, to tie the current government's policies to these monumental popular decisions by previous governments to put the country's resources in service of the welfare of the population. If there's something that defines the fourth transformation of Mexico, the López Obrador government, it's that. This is a quote from a member of Morena's Political Education Institute that I think is really capturing, right? And I'll just read it to you here. We in Morena feel we are the heirs of those struggles. Our heritage is the fight for social rights, for political rights. And that is why we connect ourselves to these old struggles. Although they are from the past, they're still very present, because even today it's still necessary to defend everything that Cárdenas fought for, what López Mateos, who nationalized the electricity industry, fought for, what Mexican revolutionary Pancho Villa fought for, and Mexican revolutionary Emiliano Zapata, and so many other popular leaders also fought for. This idea that this is part of a string of struggle that's happening in the country. So to go back to what I was saying about one of the hypotheses that I'm putting here, unable to win the population, the opposition is seeking to exert power and influence via other means. So, like I said, despite having successfully 2 sizable demos, it's unlikely that the opposition is able to translate this into mobilization of the defense of the union into electoral victories, right? So we have elections in the state of Mexico, which is like the state that's kind of surrounds Mexico City, coming up in a couple of weeks. Sorry, not a couple of weeks, but in a couple of months, very soon. And then the presidential election, which will also have the lower house of Congress elected as well in 2024. López Obrador is not allowed to run for re-election under the Mexican Constitution. Right now, we're kind of in the midst of who's going to be the candidate, who's going to be the successor. But should be clear that unless something catastrophic happens, Morena, the ruling party, the party of López Obrador, is going to win. All right, but every poll after poll, there isn't a single poll that puts the opposition in first place, not even close. And also, depending on the candidate, it's actually another landslide victory. So it's very unlikely that the opposition is going to be able to win. So that's really important to keep in mind in terms of what's happening. Well, I mentioned sort of the other strongholds. One of them is the courts. The courts have actually suspended the reform to the National Electoral Institute. So we'll see what happens. The response of the government has been very much like, okay, that's fine. Next time in 2024, we're going to try to win a supermajority so that we can make the constitutional reforms that we need. So this is why do I think it's important to give all of this context. What we're seeing right now is this effort to try to label AMLO as a threat to democracy, that he's undermining democracy in Mexico, taking the country back to its quote unquote authoritarian past, right? The era of the PRI, which ruled as a single party for 70 years. Mainstream media coverage has also depicted the proposed law in a negative light. You know, in the New York Times, they said it was an effort to, quote, undermine the country's fragile institutions, right? And, you know, the INE has been praised for its technical capacity, but it's a very expensive, it has an excessive budget, it's the most expensive authority in the region. It's reasonable that, you know, that law could be presented to make an effort to change that. But all of these relatively modest changes are presented as threats to the country's institutions, as threats to democracy, and that follows a very specific pattern of any progressive, any leftist government in the region. And here we say this kind of effort to, I think, is really clear. So if you followed any of these stories, you'll see this kind of language repeated once over and over and over again. But this is the one that I think really kind of captures it. And it comes from this commentary piece called Mexico Takes Another Step Towards Authoritarian Path, written by Valerie Wirtschafter and Arturo Zurracan, who's actually the former foreign policy advisor and former ambassador to the US for Felipe Calderón, a far-right president from 2 terms ago. And in that, he writes, the last thing that AMLO wants to do at the swearing-in ceremony for Mexico's next president is place the presidential sash over the shoulders of an opposition president-elect, and in doing so, jeopardize the legacy of so-called fourth transformation and the survival of his pet project and policies. That pretty much says it all. That, like I said previously, unless something catastrophic happens, if polls are to be believed, Morena is going to win in 2024. It's almost a sure thing. And yet they're placing this idea that his efforts to reform the National Electoral Institute, his threats against the country's institutions are an effort to commit fraud, to install his own successor. It's all a lie. It's this idea to try to weaken the mandate, the legitimacy of the next president, which is very likely to be from Morena. That's what's happening. They're seeing this government following through on its commitments, and it's very much affecting the interests of Canadian and US capital. And these actors are now worried that it's going to continue, if not further radicalize, under his successor. And that is very much informing their decision. And so that's why you're seeing this effort. It's what we saw in Bolivia in 2019, this idea that they tried to sell us this notion that Evo Morales committed fraud to be reelected. Obviously, you know, the OAS played a huge role in that, but it turned out after, you know, vigorous research and investigation that all of the OAS's claims at the time were false, and they were driven by a political narrative, right? And so that's kind of what's happening here in Mexico now. They're trying to lay the foundation of in the future to question the legitimacy of the next government. And like I said, you know, this labeling him as a threat to the country and democracy is a classic strategy. There is a danger, right? The approval of this happened relatively quickly, and so it's very much, I think we would safe to assume that in the next election, they're going to cry fraud because they're like, the opposition is likely to lose, and they're going to say, well, that's because it wasn't free and fair. And these can eventually lead to the application of sanctions by Washington, by Ottawa, as they have done elsewhere. And that's very dangerous because, again, we don't really have time to get into it today, but sanctions, I specialize on the issue when it comes to Venezuela. And you can't imagine sort of the punishing effects that it has on the population. We're talking about people literally dying as a result of these sanctions. And that's something that could happen here in Mexico as well. We're already seeing them laying the foundations for that sort of behavior, and that's very worrisome. And I'm going to conclude on this point. I know I'm a little bit over time, and I know our next speaker, he wrote an excellent article for Canadian Dimension around the way that Canadian political elites are acting in the interests of Canadian capital and interfering in the country. But I do want to really kind of highlight this because it can manifest itself in certain ways, right? So we have the obvious, right? We have following the US's lead. We're seeing this ultimatum that the US apparently wants to deliver against Mexico for its efforts to secure energy sovereignty, which is obviously, against the interests of US foreign policy and the interests of Canadian capital in particular, which has made a lot of investments in so-called green energy here in Mexico. But I want to say that these three things that I talked about at the very, very beginning about how, sometimes we need to have a very kind of specific analysis of what Canadian imperialism looks like in the region. Canada has its own independent imperialist project in Latin America. It has its own interests that acts on the interests of Canadian capital, the Canadian state. I love this joke that Canada isn't really a real country. My respects to people who do identify with the Canadian state, but that it's just three mining companies in a trench coat, right? It's kind of sad but true. It's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek comment, but it very much is guided. It's not coincidence that so many mining companies are headquartered in Canada. It's because there's collusion between the state, right? We talk about some of the catastrophic human rights violations that happen as a result of mining developments throughout Latin America, Mexico being no exception. But often we don't talk about these very toothless watchdogs that Canada keeps implementing that, they issue this or that report, but ultimately Canada is never really going to do anything that's going to affect the interests of Canadian capital via the mining industry. So that's what I mean by its own independent imperialist project. But it's also part of the US-led hegemonic effort in the region and in the world, right? The imperialist club, we can call it. It does things to say, we're on the same team. We're together on this. And the issue around GMO corn is a really good example here in Mexico. And then finally, of course, the specific action that Canada does as a state to protect the interests of Canadian capital abroad. So I mentioned the imperialist project. Bianca mentioned at the very beginning, so I'll go through this very quickly. The Canadian government under Robert Borden was an associate of the dictatorship under Porfirio Diaz, had significant investments, and actually this is something that Tyler Shipley, a professor at Humber College, told me. He's an author of Canada and the World, a very good book about Canada's own imperialism throughout the world and its internal colonialism as well. It said that Mexico during the revolution actually sent advisors to help Diaz remain in power. Ultimately didn't. The revolution toppled him. I remember this as well. Prime Minister Stephen Harper was among the first to recognize Calderón's fraudulent election in 2006. And it was very deliberate political action. It was a means of saying, hey, Canada backs you. You're in the midst of this very delicate situation. There's widespread belief that your election was not legitimate. There were mass mobilizations in the street demanding a recount. But Stephen Harper recognizes and actually travels to Mexico to take part in his occupation in order to sort of send that signal, which I thought was really telling. As I said, Canada also being a member of the broader US-led hegemonic effort. Canada broke relations with Lázaro Cárdenas, who I mentioned earlier, nationalized the oil industry because of that action, despite it didn't affect Canadian companies. There were not Canadian interests it was mostly British and US. But to to signal to the world, hey, we're part of the same club, we're going to break relations with you for doing this. Even the US actually took it much better than Canada. And then this response here from Tyler Shipley, where he says, it gives you a sense of Canada's politics, that Canada felt entitled to punish a Mexican government that was carrying out a policy that was good for the Mexican people. Sorry. I think I'm Chinese. Okay. So I mentioned the GMO issue as being one of the key examples of how this is manifesting itself now. And I'll quote from this article from Ontario, titled US-Mexico Corn Dispute Unlikely to Affect Canada. Quote, unlike the US outlook, where growers in the marketplace would have to adjust expectations, Canada has little direct involvement in this dispute. The challenge may come in any fallout that might affect agriculture in this country, says Ron Campbell, Ontario Agribusiness Association. So Mexico takes a decision to protect its indigenous corn. It's now rejecting the sale, the presence of genetically modified corn here in the country. And this is, despite the fact that Canada really doesn't have any interest in this, is joined up in this dispute as a means of sort of flexing its muscle, which is a great modern day example. When it comes to the energy issue, here it is again. The United States and Canada accuse López Obrador of trying to favor Mexico's state-owned utility over power plants built by foreign and private investors. We should read that differently, built by US and Canadian capital. Something that is forbidden under the three countries' free trade pact, which is a lie. This is something that is often not talked about, but there is a very specific article that was put in by López Obrador's negotiators when the USMCA was being renegotiated, NAFTA 2.0, that specifically says Mexico, United Mexican States direct, inalienable, and imprescribable ownership of hydrocarbons. Mexico can do what it wants when it comes. It can reform its constitution. It can reform its laws when it comes to its energy interests in the country. That's never mentioned, but it's explicitly in the very same trade agreement that they highlight so often. And I'm going to close with this because I think our next speaker is going to get much more into detail. We had this quite tragic tweet, I would say, from Tamino Minerals. It's a mining company based on Bay Street that says, we have made the right move. We have decided to move into Peru due to the uncertainty concerning Mexico's political instability, and we are exploring for lithium. So Mexico nationalized its lithium exploration, and that did not sit well with Tamino Minerals Incorporated. So what are they saying? They're calling it political instability. There's no political instability here. This is a very stable government. But what they don't like is that there's a government that is taking actions in favor of using its natural resources for the benefit of the population. That's what they consider political instability. It tells you everything you need to know about the logic of these Canadian mining companies and the people who support them inside of the Canadian state. It's just a very quick article which kind of talks about that. There's now very recently a reform, a very dramatic reform. Basically, everything that people have been asking for when it comes to reforming the neoliberal laws that were implemented to favor foreign investment, to favor the extraction of minerals, particularly during the neoliberal period. It's basically turning that all around. It's a very, very positive law. Obviously needs to go through, it's all committees and all of that, but there is very much a warm reception by actors who've been involved with the struggle. Some criticisms as well, obviously. There is the broader criticism that why are we engaging in extraction in the first place? I think that's a very necessary discussion, but not one that we're going to have today. But it's mostly about sort of what are the priorities of the government. And yes, this affects the interests of capital. This is class struggle. This is putting the interests of the Mexican working class and the campesinos, the country's poor population, ahead of the interests of capital, which for 30 plus years, really much enjoyed, very privileged situation. And so this is the struggle that's going to happen. And I know our next speaker is going to be able to speak about that. So I'll close with this. Neoliberalism undermined national sovereignty. That's one way of summing it up. And so now there's an effort to restore it. And so this is what we were talking about around the issue of security, which is not a really big issue here, but around food, around energy. And I want to play this clip because it gives you a sense, and we'll close with this one. Again, I apologize for going a little bit long, on what is the mass character? What does the political project say? It's as someone who's sympathetic to the political process that's happening here in this country, I feel energized when I see this kind of positioning happening, because this is kind of what we were waiting to happen. López Obrador inherited a very difficult situation. Very consolidated neoliberal project existed in the country, and it takes a lot of effort to try to turn that around. And so very much the early years were kind of very much focused on establishing the base, setting the foundation for what would come later. And now we're seeing it, and I for one am really grateful to see it. But it's also because he's following through on these commitments. He's following through on this effort to build a welfare state, on confronting the interests of private capital, that we're seeing this conflict, and this conflict is very much producing these kind of rhetoric. So I'm just gonna play real quick, and it's subtitles for those of you that don't speak Spanish.
cualquier atropello, pero jamás, jamás permitiremos que viole nuestra soberanía y pisotee la dignidad de nuestra patria. Cooperación, sí. Sometimiento, no. Intervencionismo, no.
So you can see there, right? That's kind of where the rhetoric is at now. And you can see, and this is what I really wanted to emphasize throughout the presentation, that the public is aware, the masses are here and they're conscious, and when they're asked defense of sovereignty, yes, right? I was in the crowd when that happened. You know that the people understand what that means, and they're defending it on that basis. And I think that's a very significant achievement. López Obrador constantly says that now Mexico counts among the most politically conscious populations in the world, and for one, I believe it. So. Just on the end here, right? How do you move forward with a political project when the political, media, economic establishment is largely dead set against you? By doing this, by turning to the masses, by flexing the capacity to mobilize. And I want to close with this quote from the person I cited earlier, David Perez, who says, I think it's very important that the opposition knows that there's a population here who's defending a national project that is popular, that is from the left, that is progressive, and is trying to do what is best for everybody. Thank you so much.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much, José Luis. I'm just going to try and switch off the screen sharing. Hold on one second. Here we go. Okay. Wow. Wow. Thank you so much for that incredibly clear, compelling, and totally comprehensive overview of the reforms, the political realities, the dynamics in Mexico, and the struggle for sovereignty. It's really heartening to see the popularity and power of AMLO and Morena, but also, concerning to see the obstacles, the hurdles faced both domestically and abroad from countries like Canada and others, and as you call it, the imperialist club. But what's clear is that it's all very live and your optimism is palpable. So thank you for helping us to cut through the spin, because we do hear a lot in the media. And also thank you for so generously sharing all those beautiful photos, helpful images. That was an incredible and deeply, deeply informative presentation. And I look forward to hearing more from you in the Q&A. I also want to remind people that if you have questions for our panelists, please do put them in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them at the end of our event. The next speaker of the evening is Owen Schalk. Owen is a columnist at Canadian Dimension and has written for Alborada, Monthly Review, Protean Magazine, and many other publications. His journalistic work focuses on Canada's domestic and foreign policy. He's the author of Canada in Afghanistan, A History of Military, Diplomatic, Political, and Media Failure 2003 to 2023. Welcome, Owen.
Hey, thank you. Thank you so much for the invite. For the opportunity to speak on this topic. And thank you, José Luis, for your terrific presentation. I think mine will build a lot on what you've introduced to this discussion and bring in Canada a little more, and the question of Canadian imperialism in Latin America, and especially in relation to Mexico right now. So I want to begin my contribution by emphasizing the oppositional nature of current Mexican and Canadian foreign policy. In Latin America, Ottawa has always been most concerned with the ability of Canada-based companies to invest, to expand their investments, and to get the greatest return that they can, regardless of the social and ecological consequences. As a result, Ottawa often chooses to align itself with the Latin American right against the left, against governments like the movement towards socialism in Bolivia or the Chavistas in Venezuela that seek to regain sovereignty over their resources, over their own decision-making, to gain independence from Washington and transnational companies based in Canada and the US. So Ottawa naturally opposes socialists and communists in Latin America who aim to make the resources in their country serve that country's people and not foreign investors. But Ottawa also opposes progressive reformists who don't seek to overturn the current status quo, but do aim to challenge it in certain ways. And that is what Ottawa has been dealing with and trying to undermine in AMLO's government. Somebody who is reformist, progressive, and who champions regional integration over the interests of Canadian and US capital. So AMLO's domestic policy is focused largely on increasing the sovereignty of the Mexican state in key economic areas like energy, while his foreign policy has been organized around the principles of anti-imperialism and non-interference. So he's developed a foreign policy that sees Mexico aligned with progressive forces in the hemisphere. But on the other hand, Justin Trudeau has continued and in some cases even ramped up a belligerent Canadian foreign policy that views those progressive states and movements as its enemies in the region. So on a range of foreign policy issues in the Americas, AMLO's administration and the Trudeau government have been on opposite sides. And I'll just run through a few examples before moving into Mexican energy, which is also an ongoing source of conflict between Canada and Mexico. So in 2019, when the Bolivian military forced Evo Morales, another left-wing and anti-imperialist president, to resign after he won the election, Trudeau's Ministry of Foreign Affairs refused to even use the word coup when describing it. On top of that, Ottawa endorsed the discredited OAS election audit that José Luis had mentioned and that the Bolivian right wing used as justification for the coup. AMLO, on the other hand, correctly stated that Morales was the victim of a coup d'etat and offered him asylum in Mexico. And AMLO remained a sharp critic of the unelected Áñez government at the same time that Trudeau and his officials were ignoring the massacres and the political repression going on in Bolivia. And later, Evo Morales himself said that AMLO's government had saved his life. Now on Venezuela and the conflict between the socialist government and the right-wing opposition, Mexico has played a very constructive role, unlike Canada. AMLO has maintained a position of non-interference and dialogue regarding Venezuela, which has included facilitating and hosting negotiations between the government and the opposition. AMLO recognizes Maduro as Venezuela's president, of course, and he has encouraged international engagement with the Maduro government, including by urging the US to reestablish relations with Caracas. And of course, it must be said that the US government knowingly sabotaged the negotiations that AMLO was hosting when they decided to arrest Venezuelan diplomat Alex Saab, which was a move, it should be said, that Canada never bothered to comment on, let alone condemn. But that's unsurprising, of course. From the beginning of the coup attempt against Maduro, Canada was helping organize and coordinate the opposition in violation of Venezuela's national sovereignty. And that interference only grew more shameless with the Lima Group later on. But back to AMLO. We should also talk about the 9th Summit of the Americas. AMLO was the first regional leader to boycott that summit due to Biden's exclusion of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. And with that move, AMLO helped to expose the illegitimacy of that forum as a neutral center for collaboration and debate amongst regional leaders. And I also want to touch on Peru, because the difference between Mexico and Canada's approach to the question of Pedro Castillo's overthrow is really striking. AMLO has been a firm critic of Dina Boluarte's unelected and extremely repressive government in Peru. He has been very vocal in condemning the violent repression that Boluarte has unleashed against the largely rural, indigenous, and left-wing protesters in the country. For example, he refused to pass the presidency of the Pacific Alliance to Peru on the grounds that doing so would legitimize an undemocratic coup d'etat. And he urged members of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, or CELAC, to condemn the state's repression of protesters in Peru. Ottawa, by contrast, sided very openly with the Peruvian right wing. Ottawa quickly recognized Boluarte, and the Canadian ambassador in Lima distinguished himself as one of the most active international supporters of her unelected and widely reviled government. During the height of the national uprising in Peru, the Canadian ambassador met with many of Boluarte's ministers, including the Vulnerable Populations Minister, the Mining Minister, and the Minister of Production, as well as Boluarte herself, all while people were being massacred in the street, and many governments in the region, including AMLO's, were condemning Boluarte's repression of protesters. But the reasons for Ottawa's support are obvious, and they shine a light on the imperialist nature of Canada's foreign policy in Latin America. And in this case, it's all about the mining and Canada's ability to continue investing in things like lithium extraction within Peru, which the current dictatorship era constitution not only allows, but promotes. And that's a constitution that Castillo had indicated he wanted to change. But the Peruvian right and the current president, as the right's president, have catered to those transnational companies and thus to Ottawa's wishes. And now, having established that contrast between Ottawa's approach to regional issues and AMLO's, I want to transition into an example that more directly illustrates conflict between the current governments of Canada and Mexico. And that example is energy. AMLO has made strengthening Mexico's state-owned energy companies a priority as he tries to move his country closer to energy sovereignty. And this move has brought him into disagreement with Canada and the US, former NAFTA partners and current partners in the CUSMA. We know what entry into NAFTA meant for Mexico in the 1990s. This embrace of free market policies and unrestricted foreign investment had horrible effects on the living and working conditions of Mexican people. But now we're into the CUSMA, a different trade agreement, but very similar in a lot of ways. And what has not changed is Canada and the US's focus on keeping Mexico neoliberal for the benefit of their own companies. But what has changed is that Mexico now has a government that is challenging that paradigm in some notable ways. And we can see this in the ongoing energy dispute. Energy sovereignty is a central pillar of AMLO's political program, and it's a program that only makes more sense as time passes. For instance, the world has seen the consequences in Europe of states that choose to rely on other countries for their energy needs. If unforeseen divisions of some kind arise between the countries, as happened with the war in Ukraine, that really endangers the importers' ability to maintain a stable energy sector and leaves them scrambling for access to other markets. And especially in Latin America, if a country is relying on the US, that's a really dangerous thing because any kind of progressive turn in that country will bring down the ire of the US. So this is the kind of dependency that AMLO wants to avoid with these reforms. But as AMLO attempts to strengthen the hand of the state in areas like oil and gas, like electricity, mining, reducing Mexico's dependency on other countries, as well as the role of foreign companies in those sectors, Trudeau officials have sought to hinder his ability to do so. So in July of last year, Trudeau's international trade minister flew to Mexico City to express Ottawa's concerns about new regulations in Mexico's energy sector, claiming that these are a violation of the CUSMA and that Canada would begin consultations to address these concerns. The Biden administration, meanwhile, has said that AMLO's energy policies unfairly discriminate against US companies. And Canada has endorsed this thinking, joining Biden's challenge to AMLO's energy reforms. But what do these reforms actually involve? Basically, AMLO is reversing the energy liberalization policies enacted under his predecessors, like the 2014 reforms introduced by Peña Nieto that were encouraged by Washington. And this reversal has involved giving state oil company Pemex a controlling interest in some major projects, for instance, the Sama oil fields. And AMLO's energy plans have also involved nationalizing lithium reserves, building and rehabilitating refineries to refine the oil extracted in Mexico rather than sending it to the US to be refined, and announcing that Pemex will soon stop selling crude oil abroad altogether and only extract the oil that Mexico needs to meet its own domestic gasoline and diesel needs. And we can see Canada's very condescending and dismissive attitude toward AMLO's reforms on the webpage of the Canadian Trade Commissioner in Mexico. That page reads, "With the flag of recovering Mexico's energy sovereignty, AMLO has implemented a series of modifications in terms of policies, structure, and operation of the sector. The new paradigm is not necessarily based on economic or market principles, but on ideological assumptions, as well as a nationalistic approach that restricts private participation in the Mexican energy market. So clearly, in the mind of Canada's Trade Commissioner, AMLO is blinded by what he calls, or what they call, ideological assumptions. While Canadian and US officials are supposedly rational and clear-eyed in their attempts to keep the Mexican energy sector open to unrestricted foreign investment. And yet, AMLO keeps making moves. So recently he purchased 13 power plants from a Spanish company for $6 billion. And this deal means that the majority of electricity production in Mexico is now controlled by the state. Before AMLO, it was 40%. Currently, it's 56%. And now he's making some big proposals in the mining sector, seeking to increase the state role in mining generally and implement a range of new environmental laws, which have angered transnational mining companies quite a bit. And all of these factors built toward the Biden administration issuing an ultimatum to AMLO at the end of March, what Reuters called an act now or else message. In other words, a threat that AMLO needs to back off his moves to increase Mexican sovereignty in these areas. And if AMLO doesn't abide, we will likely see the US and or Canadian representatives initiate a dispute settlement. And if the panel rules against Mexico, but AMLO holds firm, the US and Canada will certainly begin to act even more aggressively. So the threats coming from Washington and Ottawa have been coupled with really negative coverage for AMLO in the US and Canadian press, as happened with Evo Morales, with Nicolas Maduro, with Pedro Castillo to some extent as well, demonizing him as a wannabe autocrat, somebody who is gutting fair elections and threatening democracy and stability in Mexico. On the Canadian side, I'm thinking of an article written by Evan Dyer in CBC last year, where he said that AMLO was channeling Trump in his attempts to supposedly dismantle Mexican democracy. The reality, though, is clearly the opposite. AMLO is popular, with a significant public mandate to enact the kinds of progressive changes domestically and in foreign policy that he's pursuing now. On the international stage, AMLO has borrowed from the tradition of Mexico's non-interference to craft a foreign policy centered around anti-imperialism. While on the domestic scale, he is focused on increasing state sovereignty in important economic areas like oil and gas, like minerals, like agriculture. By contrast, Ottawa has continued to promote the interest of the transnational business sector, as it does throughout the region, while attempting to prevent any future movement towards state sovereignty in Mexico. And by trying to hinder these policies, Canada and the US are not only attempting to weaken AMLO's government, they are threatening to weaken Mexican democracy as it currently exists, the exact thing that they hypocritically accuse AMLO himself of doing. So thank you. That's my contribution. Once more, I appreciate the opportunity to speak on this topic.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Owen. That was an excellent presentation. So clear. Thank you for detailing Canada's dismissal of AMLO's reforms, as well as many of the oppositional policies that you detailed and attempts to weaken the Morena government in the face of these changes that we are seeing in Mexico, in particular, the response that we're seeing to moves towards nationalization, sovereignty efforts. Also want to thank you for your incredible journalism more generally around Canada's role in the world and domestically, and look really forward to hearing more from you in the Q&A. So the next speaker of the evening is Lucy Sharratt. Lucy works in Halifax as the coordinator of the Canadian Biotechnology Action Network, also known as CBAN, which brings together 15 groups to research, monitor, and raise awareness about issues relating to genetic engineering in food and farming. Their members include farmer associations, environmental and social justice orgs, regional coalitions of grassroots groups. So Lucy's going to be detailing an important intervention that's happening right now that's calling on Ottawa to cease its efforts to force Mexico to abandon its efforts to phase out, excuse me, imports of GMO corn and the use of glyphosate. Welcome, Lucy.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for providing this context to just bring forward in these quick minutes the example here of Canada's response to the government of Mexico's phase out presidential decree that came into force in early 2021, the phase out of the use of the herbicide glyphosate in Mexico, as well as the import of genetically modified corn. You could call it genetically engineered corn. And so this presidential decree that was made to phase out these products by January 2024 was also done in the name of replacing these with sustainable and culturally appropriate alternatives in the context of the president's own inauguration speech, which called for self-sufficiency in grain production and a return to indigenous ways of farming. During his campaign, the president had promised a ban on all genetically modified crops and connected this to the need to support traditional agricultural practices, as well as concerns over the human health harms from glyphosate and environmental and potential human health harms from genetically modified corn. And this decree was met with immediate opposition from the biotechnology industry, of course, that sells these products, demanding in the US Senate that Mexico immediately rescind its anti-CUSMA, so the Canada-US-Mexico agreement, anti-CUSMA decree, and begin creating a gene editing framework that conforms with international norms and trade agreement commitments. So without getting into the details, the latter statement is a reference to the biotechnology industry's global attempts to remove regulation from new genetic engineering techniques called gene editing. And so the context here, of course, is that the Canadian government has a policy that generally writ large supports the biotechnology industry as an economic driver. And though, as was presented earlier, in fact, Canada has very little impact would be felt in Canada from this decree, from this phase out. Similarly in the United States. But the context, of course, is the kind of power behind the biotechnology industry, that the United States is the world's largest producer of GM crops, producing approximately 40%, mostly corn, soy, and cotton. Genetically modified corn is one of very few genetically modified crops on the market, and it's specifically twinned with herbicides and mostly with the herbicide glyphosate. So in fact, the two products of genetically modified corn and the herbicide glyphosate, these are twinned together, though there's two traits in the corn themselves. Insect resistance is also a major trait in corn, but it's just to say that, in fact, the companies that sell these two products, they sell both products. 6 companies control over half of the world's commercial seed market and over half of the agrochemical market. And in this context, Mexican farmers are fighting for food sovereignty. Farmers across Latin America have articulated the political concept, the political tool of food sovereignty, and they've been very clear that genetic engineering isn't a part of that vision. And the fight back to the phase out is of concern to the Canadian government because the same concerns are shared by many in Canada around the use of genetic engineering, around the use of glyphosate, the questions of environmental and health impacts. So I was asked to mention what's happening in Canada, which is that as an initiative from the Council of Canadians and specifically from volunteers, that there have been 3 letters now written by Canadian civil society asking the minister, the international trade minister, to support or certainly not obstruct Mexico's decision around this phase out. But already in early March, Canada requested a formal consultation with Mexico following, of course, a US request under the CUSMA trade agreement. But in fact, the CUSMA agricultural biotechnology section is very clear that it does not require a party to mandate an authorization for a product of agricultural biotechnology to be on the market. And Canada, as the US is also, are appealing to CUSMA as if this is a legitimate complaint under CUSMA, and particularly a violation of the sanitary and phytosanitary chapter, which also clearly grants Mexico the right to establish its own standards for public health protection. So there's a lot of media again around this issue that makes more sense also in the context of the presentations that have been provided. Mexico has already revised its decree in February of this year from its original decree to allow for the importation of US corn for animal feed, but not for human feed. And this is really a distinction between yellow corn in the US and the white corn that's really important to food sovereignty in Mexico. But it's important to know that there's already been contamination of some Mexican corn. Farmers have found that contamination previously and have worked really hard to get rid of that contamination. Mexico is the global home of corn, as well as it being, of course, extremely culturally important. So the concept here of sovereignty, of food sovereignty and national sovereignty are bound together in corn for Mexico. And yet this is connected between Canada, the US, and Mexico, including through other kinds of realities, such as the migration of monarch butterfly, which the species is at risk because of the use of glyphosate, the overuse of glyphosate in the US Corn Belt, for example. So we are tied together, the three countries, on this issue of genetic modification and glyphosate. And there are ongoing efforts in Canada to continue to discuss the issues here for Mexico, but also for Canada. And certainly the Canadian government argues that there's no science base behind this decision. Mexico has fought back on that very clearly. They have provided detailed databases of papers discussing the risks of both the corn and glyphosate. And they've held a webinar and will be holding more webinars, we understand. And this is something that we can continue to highlight as well. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lucy. Thank you for your work on this intervention. Very, very important. The fight for food sovereignty in Mexico. And I think it's very important for us here in Canada to be aware of our country's response to Mexico's efforts to phase out the GMO corn and glyphosate, and to understand sort of what's being pushed for and done in our name and its impact. So I've placed the media release in the chat, as well as a link to CBAN, the Canadian Biotechnology Actions Network, so that people can follow developments there. But it's really great to see that there is action that's being taken. Thank you so much, Lucy, and thank you for joining us too on such short notice. So everybody, please do keep abreast of developments, stay engaged with what may turn into a campaign. So thank you so much, Lucy. And I think, and you're not going to be joining us for the Q&A, so I just want to thank you so much for being a part of this webinar. And we will send all of the registrants as well information about that press release and the work that you're doing. Thank you. Our next speaker of the evening is Meizhu Lui. Meizhu coordinated the national Closing the Racial Wealth Gap initiative and co-wrote the book, The Color of Wealth, the story behind the US racial wealth divide. With comrades on the left, she was a co-founder of the Mexico Solidarity Project in 2019. Welcome, Meizhu. Oh, I think you're still on mute. Oh, Meizhu, I think you're, yeah, perfect.
You. So I'm not sure I'm able to share my screen.
Yeah, it's working. We can see it.
Working. Okay. So so thank you so much for letting me speak for a few minutes, and I'll try to be very brief. When we see news, we see images like this, the Tres Amigos. This was their January annual meeting of the three countries. And it looks like they're all sort of equal, even though AMLO is a little shorter. But the reality behind the picture is really this. It's the United States that's clearly in the lead. It's not three equal partners. It's not three friends. It's the Lone Ranger, and Canada acts as kind of one of his posse, maybe his main posse member. But then you've got Mexico, which is really subservient to the wishes of the Lone Ranger. So I think our job really, and all of you are doing that, is to kind of peel back what we see in the mainstream media and to really get at the reality of what's going on. So the Mexico Solidarity Project was founded in 2019, and it's partly because people know so little about Mexico, even though it's so close to us and its fate is so closely connected to our own, particularly people in the US, but also Canada. For example, how many people in the United States know that the US invaded Mexico 14 times? Although they do read it in the news right now that the Republicans are about to do it again, or would like to do it again to solve the so-called fentanyl crisis. And secondly, that there is little understanding of the importance of Mexico to the United States, and not just vice versa. And Owen, you've mentioned the trade agreements, the US, Mexico, Canada agreement, and we all, or at least those of us who are progressive, know that all of the predictions came true, that those agreements greatly expanded the wealth of the multinational companies and made the living standards of workers in all three countries decline. So for that reason, the Mexico Solidarity Project has a Mexico labor support group that we do with labor notes, and it is trinational. So there are Canadians who are part of that committee as well. If Mexico can improve its workers' living standards, that will reverse the race to the bottom. And lastly, we formed the project because we saw the victory of AMLO and Morena as the best opportunity in 80 some years since Cardenas's nationalization of oil to finally challenge US imperialism again. And both Jose and Owen have spoken to that. I mean, AMLO boycotting the Summit of the Americas was significant, and that led to other countries of Latin America also boycotting, and those who were there speaking directly from the podium, criticizing Biden for his anti-democratic attempt to manipulate who could come and who could not come, who could be named as an American state and who could not. So I guess for some of these reasons, we would see Mexico as the tip of the wave of the pink tide that we have all welcomed. I think without Mexico, you will see a problem, and perhaps with the dissolution of the last pink tide, without a strong anchor like Mexico, that might not work. Brazil is of course important, but we would contend, and that might be a topic for another time, that Mexico is even more important as an anchor of that effort going on. So just to say then that what is known about Mexico is either seen through a corporatist lens, through a neoliberal lens. It's all about defending the corporations, as Owen has so ably pointed out, and it's also racist. So the portrayal of AMLO as an autocrat and a buffoon just plays into the stereotypes of Latin America leaders that has been going on for a long time. And when Trump called Mexican migrants rapists and murderers trying to come in and wreak havoc on the US population, hello, we do a good job of wreaking havoc on ourselves, so we don't need anybody else. But in a way, he was simply voicing what has been a stereotype for a long time and which continues today. So we really have a huge job, and that's why this forum is really important. What you're doing, Bianca, is really important to bring news and analyses from a working class point of view to counter those, neoliberal racist tropes that we see all the time, sometimes openly, sometimes hidden, but those are the messages that our public is getting. And we have seen that those attacks are ramping up. And we think that is partly because we have 2024 elections coming up, and both the Republicans and the Democrats are vying to be the ones who can vilify Mexico the most, as usual, making Mexico the whipping boy for all of the ills that are happening in the United States today, from drug violence to gun, etc. And we know where that really comes from. I have to say, I think that Trudeau and and Biden are also just jealous of AMLO after all this time, that he's got all this support. And this is one of Jose's photos from that great demonstration of over 1 million people. Could Trudeau or Biden get that out? I don't think so. And they're probably bound for the history books, not in the best way. So just to close, we really hope that you all will join us, those of you who are on this webinar who are journalists too. Let us know if it's something that you're interested in. We have a new network that is dedicated to putting out alternative viewpoints about what's going on in Mexico, to sort of stave off efforts by our two governments to undercut Mexico's gains and to protect their own corporations. So here's our bulletin. I put in the chat as well how you can subscribe, and just really appreciate Bianca and others the opportunity to co-sponsor this today and to be able to present to you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Meizhu, for that wonderful presentation. I'm just switching off the screen sharing here. And for helping us to just cut through the fog of the mainstream media's coverage of Mexico, as well as you so importantly highlight the racism in these messages. And thanks also for the important historical context that is so critical. Please do find out more about the Mexico Solidarity Project. The link is in the chat. And I'm looking so forward to hearing more from you, Meizhu, in the Q&A. So that concludes our presentations for the evening. Thank you so much to our panelists. I feel like I have learned so much already. We do not have that much time for the Q&A left, but we will try and take a few of your questions. There are a number of people who have posted in the Q&A box. Thank you for that. So the first question is from Marlene, who says, I see parallels with the situation in Venezuela under Chavez. Are there any lessons to be learned from the Venezuelan experience? Is there anyone that would like to comment on Marlene's question?
Sure, I'll tackle that, since I also work a lot on Venezuela. I first traveled to Venezuela back in 2005, many years ago, with a part of the Canadian delegation to the World Festival of Youth and Students. Now, there might actually be some people in the chat who were part of that. A lot of really great activists came out of that experience. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, one of the things that I've kind of been insisting to the people in the Mexico Solidarity Project, to key players in the communications team inside of the Mexican government, precisely that there are parallels. As I said during my presentation, a lot of what we're seeing now is what we saw in the early days of the Bolivarian Revolution under the leadership of President Hugo Chavez. Basically, this effort to try to, as Meizhu said, to try to paint a Latin American leader as a buffoon, as someone who's erratic, as someone who's an autocrat. It's kind of the same script, and it's one that's very much being applied. I remember, so López Obrador does a lot of kind of folksy, tongue-in-cheek kind of comments. He holds for people who don't know, he holds a press conference Monday to Friday, between 2 and 3 hours long every day, direct dialogue with journalists. It's incredible. In fact, it's weird because people view it as him trying to impose his agenda on everybody. But like, imagine if we had that kind of access to leaders in the US and Canada, right? Where you could directly grill. Any journalist can go, as long as they, sign up to participate, and go and ask a question and have a direct dialogue with the president. It's an incredible exercise. I think there's something a lot to be appreciated about it. But anyway, and in these, he'll talk about some of like, these amulets that protect him, or somebody sent him a picture of like this ghost in a tree. And those are the things that get printed in the media, right? When we were talking, there's a lot about talk about the issue of fentanyl and the trafficking of fentanyl across borders and things like that. And he was making an observation that one of the problems inside of the United States is that there isn't enough of an attention being paid to of making sure that we're being taken care of, right? That there are recreational activities for children, that they have opportunities, that they feel a sense of belonging in their homes, right? But what was the headline that we saw in media outlets? López Obrador says the problem with fentanyl in the US is not enough hugs. Like taking one very specific thing about his answer and trying to portray him as kind of like this character, this cartoonish character. That's part of it, and that's part of what's happening But it's also what that I mentioned in the presentation, this idea that the next election isn't going to be legitimate, that if Morena wins, it's because of fraud, and therefore we're going to have to apply sanctions, or we're going to have to apply tariffs, et cetera, et cetera. So using the tools of the imperialist international system, what they like to call the rules-based international order, which is a farce, in order to try to punish Mexico for doing everything that Owen talked to us about, right? Of putting the nation's resources at the service of the state in order to redistribute it. Like I said, I think the key thing there is that because it affects the class interests. That's what this is. It's a manifestation of class struggle. And so that's likely what we're going to see more of. And in terms of what lessons can we draw from it, is being proactive now. I'm so grateful for the work of the Mexican Solidarity Project, that it exists. And we really, over the last few months, have really kind of taken off in terms of being able to respond. But you yourselves, if you see this negative coverage, right, like participate in the dialogue that happens on social media, talk to your representatives. In fact, especially in Canada, I have the sense it's a little bit easier to access your elected representatives. Obviously the barrier is just the same, but actually, having a conversation, bringing up some of these materials that we've heard, the excellent presentation from around GMO and being like, actually, your political line is saying that this is because it's not scientific. Well, here's the scientific evidence that we have. That kind of work is really, really important, but also, one good place to start is following the work of writers like Owen. I'm a big fan of his journalism. Subscribing to the bulletin, because that's also going to be a space where we can continually be in touch with people. And we do know that, particularly as we get closer to the elections, there's going to be even further ramping up of this kind of interference, and that's when we're going to need people to express their disagreement with this kind of imperialist action that's happening towards Mexico. And so we need to kind of expand our capacity to be able to respond, particularly in English, right? The fact that we share a border, there's still a language barrier, right? There's in fact, for what we were putting together, the team to come participate, it's something that we're challenged with. It's like we need to have more people that will be able to respond in English, because that's the language that's spoken, or in French as well, obviously. If you could help us with that and try to get the information out, that's actually one of the things that I think Venezuela did too late, right? Telesur English was founded in 2014, way too late in terms of being able to kind of present that counter narrative. There's still time now. I'm of the belief that that we probably will see a radicalization of the process, and it's going to bring even more negative attention. And so we're going to need to really double our efforts in that regard.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, I'm reminded of an article that was in Orinoco Tribune not too long ago that went over the reasons why the Bolivarian Revolution endured and has endured despite facing so many challenges internally and externally. And I think several of those reasons apply well to the Mexican context. So obviously popular support generated by following through with progressive policies is central to the continuation of the fourth transformation. And the author of that piece, whose name escapes me, also pointed out the dysfunctional nature of the opposition. I think clearly popular support for the government on the one hand and an inept opposition on the other are clear similarities to the Venezuelan context and indications that Morena will continue to be dominant in Mexican politics. And in terms of lessons to be learned, I think just following through with progressive policy proposals is essential to cultivating that public support. And evidently, AMLO's willingness to follow through in a lot of areas has contributed to that public support for his government in Mexico.
Just quickly, there's a role for us as well, people in these other countries, to pressure our own governments to keep their hands off and let people exercise their own will in these countries. And that's partly what this is all about, getting the real news out there and generating the support and pressure on our own governments to stop their imperialist behaviors.
Absolutely. We have two questions about the nationalization of Mexico's natural resources. Mark wants to know, Mark says sovereignty, quote unquote, is a good counter to imperialism, but isn't a world of competing nations for energy resources still a bad dream? And Gail says the fourth transition is exciting for all progressive thinkers who care about social justice. Clearly, the nationalization of Mexico's natural resources is essential. I wonder what the hopefully elected government will advance progressive policy related to the climate crisis caused in large part by extraction, processing, use of fossil fuels. and wonders whether there's been consideration around revenue generation, wealth taxes, et cetera, for the capitalist elite. So do any of you have thoughts around this, sort of the climate crisis and the nationalization of natural resources?
Well, Mexico is committed to renewable energies. The thing that the media has been saying is that they're against renewables because they've stopped the energy auctions, which were really just a way for multinationals to come in and get those contracts and under very favorable deals. So again, it's part of the nationalization process for Mexico to be in control of its own energy sector, including its renewable energy sector.
Thank you, Meizhu. Any other thoughts from our panelists on that?
Just again, Claudia Scheinbaum in Mexico City, there's the largest array of solar panels and solar power in anywhere, I think, am I right, Jose, in the world, or at least in Latin America? Yeah, so there's definitely a commitment to greening the sector.
One of the things that really struck me in your comments was just how sort of independent it seems Mexico's policies are from the US, for instance. And I think that there's often an argument that Canada can't have its own independent foreign policy because of these trade relations that we have with the US, like it's just not possible. But yet Mexico is even more dependent than Canada is on the US. And so I guess I'm just wondering, you know, what are the lessons that we have to learn here as Canada from Mexico, right? In terms of following their own, you know, these policies, these reforms, and for other countries, both in Latin America and beyond. What is the example that can be followed here? You know, I'm wondering if any of you have any thoughts on that. Around the idea of an independent foreign policy, one that's not aligned with the US and empire.
Well, I think that speaks to something José Luis talked about in his presentation, which is Canada having its own imperialist interest in Latin America, and not just being joined to US imperialism, but Canadian imperialism very much being its own thing as well. So Canada has a lot of material interests, and Canadian leaders do, in exploiting countries in Latin America. So if we're going to talk about Canada needing to create its own independent foreign policy, I think first and foremost that has to be challenging Canadian imperialism.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I would just say too, like Europe has found out why energy sovereignty is important. And it doesn't mean, you know, I think in answer to Mark, you know, sovereignty is about controlling your own natural resources. But if you don't have enough energy yourselves, to be able to shop in the marketplace for the best deals and not be tied to some neoliberal agreement where you have to buy from this particular country for this particular price and have it be the source that you go to before you can even use your own, which was happening in Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Meizhu mentions the situation of Europe, and I think it's quite telling. You know, we recently saw Macron visit China and come back and saying that we shouldn't be vassals, that we shouldn't have to follow exactly the US's lead on everything, especially when it comes to foreign policy. And you saw Macron is no hero of the left, let's be clear about that. But even then, somebody like him making a statement like that, incredible backlash, just incredible, large, strong criticism of that position. What does that tell us? That Canada can have an independent foreign policy if it confronts its imperialist relationship, but it's going to be necessary to have sort of that mass base. There has to be a mass mobilization around these. For people who may not be aware, I lived many years in Canada, in Toronto specifically, and I was involved with social movements and political movements there. And there's this kind of a tendency, particularly amongst the parliamentary left, that's sort of like the focus group solution to everything, right? Like if we just workshop every talking point, if we just have a focus group around everything, then we'll present the perfect manifesto, the perfect platform, and that's what will get us elected. But there isn't this bet on the role of mass politics, and that's why I was making so much an emphasis on it during my presentation. I had a friend who's very important amongst the Canadian Social Democratic left come visit And she asked me that question around like, well, how do you do it then? How is López Obrador so popular if everybody in the elites are against him? If every news outlet begins by criticizing him, if all the pundits, if all the think tanks, all of the columnists are constantly criticizing him because of that, because he knows that there are millions of people who he can count on, if necessary, to mobilize. And that's kind of the direction that I think if there are Canadians who are serious about delinking, you know, their interests to U.S. interests, then it's going to take that. It's a different kind of approach to that, and it's obviously much harder. But that's actually what's going to be able to do it, because otherwise, you know, that same kind of backlash is going to manifest itself that we're seeing against Macron in Europe, right? But it's perfectly possible. The previous government and the previous 30 years to López Obrador was one that was very much, you know, that bowed before the U.S. empire. And that all changed, literally changed from one day to the next, right? As soon as he took office. And so it's quite possible to do it. It is a challenge. It took us a very long process to get to that point. But I think the fact that there is that example of somebody else who's also neighbors shows that it is possible. And I guess my last comment on this is that we need you, right? You know, as much as the contradictions continue to be manifest between capital and labor, there's still the contradiction of imperialism and national liberation, right? Venezuela is probably politically the most advanced revolution in the region, right? But what's the biggest impediment to Venezuela being able to continue to deepen, to build the socialism of the 21st century? It's imperialism, right? The biggest challenge to Venezuela is the illegal sanctions. It's the biggest challenge to Cuba are the illegal sanctions, right? Who helped the coup in Bolivia? It was US imperialism. And so resisting US and Canadian imperialism is critical in terms of advancing the global working class struggle, right? In that sense of actually practicing an internationalism that puts the international working class first, right? That understands that a defeat of imperialism anywhere is a defeat of imperialism everywhere.
Great.
Thank you, José Luis. Yeah, what is happening in Mexico is so important. And, you know, I can feel even in the chat, like the excitement around this is quite palpable. You know, if AMLO can continue making these moves in the face of tremendous international pressure, is it possible that others can do the same? And I appreciate your message, José Luis, around, you know, not crafting the absolute perfect statements, et cetera, but building power, organize, mobilize, you know, and that a lot of this political consciousness also may be latent, you know, it may be higher than we're aware of. So we have a couple more questions here that I'm going to try to get to very quickly, but we're going to wind down. We have two questions about NAFTA. Kathleen says, I heard that NAFTA opening up Mexico to US corn drove 1 million farmers off their land. Will AMLO's policies help turn that around, or is it too late? And then Paul asks, NAFTA led to the Zapatista resistance movement in Chiapas in '94. How successful has this resistance been to the neoliberal NAFTA project? Would any of our panelists like to address either of those questions?
Yeah, just real quick on the corn issue. So what happened with NAFTA is that basically Mexico got flooded with subsidized corn. Right, U.S. provides massive subsidies to its agricultural producers. Mexico can't compete, right? And they have a far more industrialized production system, and so they were able to very easily displace all of the local production. Is it too late? No. I mean, it's tough. We're talking about billions and billions of tons of corn that is consumed inside of Mexico. The yellow corn, the GMO corn, is mostly used for agricultural production, but the human consumption can very much be replaced with one that is produced here, and there is a deliberate effort. I talked about the sort of the neoliberalization of the country. That also meant that there was an effort to create a cheap pool of labor by depopulating the countryside, right? And that was a deliberate policy that happened in the previous 30 years. That's also seen a reverse. There's a deliberate effort to reinvest in the countryside, to invest in these countries, these regions in the country that are very much been marginalized, that don't have a lot of economic activities, that feed sort of the urbanization of the country. And there's an effort now to provide the subsidies, the support, so that people can stay in their communities, and that also means that they'll be able to make a living from it, and that's key.
Thank you. Any other thoughts around NAFTA from either Owen or Meizhu?
I actually have a question of my own for José Luis. When I think of the Bolivarian Revolution, one of the things I think of is the agricultural policies, the land reform, the seed law. as being like very, very important agrarian policies. And you suggested that as Morena continues being in a position of power, it could get more radical. So do you think there could be even more of a radicalization in Mexico towards agrarian policies and land reform?
I think the future of the fourth transformation really depends on who the successor is. That's kind of what everybody is really worried about right now. Very briefly, there's five candidates, but there's really three leading candidates. So there's Adán Augusto López. He's the Interior Minister, Interior Secretary. He very much kind of represents the status quo. He's like, if I'm the candidate, what you got with López Obrador, you will keep getting. There's Marcelo Ebrard, the Foreign Minister. He's always kind of been a very faithful lieutenant to López Obrador. He's been very good in that sense. He's always been very loyal. Loyalty is very highly rewarded here in Mexico, and particularly inside of Morena. But he very much kind of represents a more centrist position, right? He would represent a move to the right. He's very cozy with the US. He has a lot of interest in the US. He's somebody who comes from the middle class, who comes from a more privileged sector of Mexican society. And then there's Claudia Sheinbaum, who's the jefa de gobierno of the Mexico City, so basically the Mexico City governor. She represents the left camp. She would represent very much a sort of radicalization of the process. If she's the successor, there is a sort of a wider expectation that things will keep moving in a leftward direction. And she's very much kind of signaled that, right? Like as these different candidates kind of position themselves, she's positioning herself as, I am the left camp. And fortunately, for those of us who want to see a radicalization, she's currently leading the polls in order to be the next successor. But that's going to come in different challenges, because if you think that people were acting irresponsibly in terms of how they approach López Obrador with somebody who's more radical, it's going to get much worse, right? The thing is that with Claudia Sheinbaum is that she comes from a different, she comes from the sort of the student movement. She's an academic. She has a doctorate and all that. It'll be more difficult for them to kind of pigeonhole her in the way that they have for different Latin American leaders. She's also a woman, which would be a huge advancement. I've never had a female head of state, so that would be also quite significant, particularly because we're also in the context of a crisis of feminicides that does exist in this country. López Obrador has rightly been criticized for the way that he's decided to handle the feminist movement in the country. I think it's important to signal that this is a very legitimate, important mass mobilization that's happening, but it's also one that, like the INE that I talked about in my presentation, has kind of been, in certain sectors, in certain spaces, been co-opted by the opposition. So that, again, will also be an answer to kind of that. It'll be a very different kind of dialogue if you're dialoguing with somebody who identifies as a woman. So in that case, it really depends on who's the next successor is. Like I said, things are pointing in the right direction, and so that has me excited. I think one of the things I always said that, like, because we have 6-year terms, 1 year only, that this is going to take 2 or 3 governments to actually be able to really turn everything around. I think we're off to a great start, but we do need to try to do that. And for people who are interested in that, People's Dispatch, which is a different outlet, they published an English language interview with Claudia Sheinbaum just a few days ago. So I recommend people check out their YouTube channel or the website. It's called People's Dispatch, to see what she has to say. And she talks a lot about the ideas, and she is very good at communicating to an English speaking audience.
Awesome. Thank you for that, José Luis.
Thank you so much. And the last question I have, I'll direct it to José Luis, but others can answer, is what has the impact of these reforms that we've seen in Mexico had on the average person living in Mexico?
Sure. I actually like to answer that in kind of like a really personal way. So I'm a working class person. I was born here in Mexico, but because of neoliberalism, we actually ended up having to move away, and I lived many years in the United States and Canada, but I made the decision to come back to Mexico to take part in this, right? I kind of view myself as somebody, we always say in Spanish, granito de arena, a little grain of sand, right? What's the way that I can contribute? Because I lived abroad, because I was raised, in the United States and Canada, I speak English well, and that's my way of contributing to talk about these kinds of things. It's what I do for Venezuela Analysis. It's what I hope to do for Mexico through the Mexico Solidarity Project. But I'm a working class person, right? Like I live off of my labor power. And I have seen and experienced directly the improvements, right? So I'm a student at the National Autonomous University of Mexico City, which is a university that was founded by López Obrador, and a program called the Defense and Promotion of Human Rights, which is a program that is explicitly, has a program of study that is based around class struggle. That many of my courses talk about capitalism and imperialism and neo-imperialism and that kind of perspective. I don't pay for school because tuition there's no charge. And in fact, I received a scholarship around in Canadian dollars, it's probably like 1,000 Canadian dollars a month. And I'm able to live and dedicate myself to this work, to my studies because of this, right? I ride every day a cable car that was built by the city government that it makes my life so much better. I ride publicly subsidized public transport. It makes my life. I have medical coverage through the Social Security Institute that is focused on preventative care, right? Where I get my medicines for free. I suffer from high blood pressure and we've been able to control it. Like these are, I don't mean to say that like, hey, look at me, like everything's so great, but it's just a very personal way of me kind of sharing with you that like these are quality of life things that have happened because of the political transformation in this country. Right? Like I was able to come back and enjoy all of these things and play that role that I've always wanted to play and live a dignified life. I always say that my quality of life here is better, right? With five pesos, which is around 30 cents, I can get on the subway and I can go to one of the largest urban parks in the world and go to a zoo for free and sit and bask in the grass and play a board game with my friends and just like that quality of life. I don't have to work 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet. Like rent is rising in Mexico City, but at least there's still parts of the city where it's affordable, right? Like these are all little quality of life things. And that's just one person in Mexico City, right? And we can talk about millions. I mentioned that 75% of households, one way or another, there's somebody in that house who's either receiving a scholarship so that they can go to school, receiving a senior's pension, has access to expanded healthcare. There's still a lot more to go, right? Like there's still, for example, our education system still has a long way to go. There's a huge, like working class people end up sending their kids to private school because the public system isn't up to par. There's still a long ways to go, but there, you can see the impact. That's why he has support. That's why people, you ask them, like, despite what they see on the newscast every day, why you still support the president? Because they feel that transformation, because they sense that every day that this is a government. It's not a revolutionary government, right? Like I don't want to oversell it either, but it's clear that puts the interests of people before capital. Whereas it was always to the contrary. And that was also evident, right? Whereas it's like everything that all of the reforms that Peña Nieto passed, the previous administration, all made life worse. And this one is making life a little bit better.
So, in the United States, we don't have good public transportation systems, and a lot of people depend on their cars to get to work. And the price at the pump has been going up and fluctuates, and you never, it cuts into your income, what you have sometimes, into your food budget. In Mexico, you don't have that. Oil prices at the pump are stable, and that's because of AMLO's policies that he's kept that. So that's just an example of a difference between the stress of living in the United States versus living in Mexico. Again, there's a lot of other things that are not so perfect, but yeah.
Well, I think that's a good note on which to end Canada's response, the US's response. It matters, the response that we have to these reforms. There are real impacts on people's lives. And José Luis, the word dignity really stood out to me in your description of the changes that you have seen. And I just want to thank you all so much for participating in this discussion. It's been lively, important, and incredibly informative. So thank you, Owen, José Luis, Meizhu. You are brilliant thought leaders and activists. I've learned so much, and thank you so much for being here. We're going to rebroadcast this on YouTube. Encourage people to share this with your colleagues, friends, and family. It's really important to stay informed and to stay engaged. I also just want to let it be known that it's not possible for us to do this work at the CFPI without donations. So please do consider making a donation to foreignpolicy.ca/donations or becoming a monthly sustainer. We are in a shoestring and we need your support. So again, thanks to our incredible panelists. Thanks to the Mexico Solidarity Project. Good evening to all of you and peace.
Thank you, Bianca.